Hey crafters! Today I'm making a card for the Lavinia Stamps challenge called Dark But Bright. I hope you like my card making ideas. Thanks for joining me. So I wanted to make something that was almost iridescent. So I used my Cosmic Shimmer Pixie powders and combined them with water and spread them out on my craft desk with my brayer. And then using my piece of paper, which is 5 by 7 inches, I spread them left to right over the black paper. Now this is just regular black paper, it's not watercolor paper, so I needed to make sure that the paper didn't get too weak. So after a couple layers, I used my heat tool to dry it, and then I added some more color on top. Then I just repeated this until I was happy with my background. I was thinking that my mermaid would be swimming in an iridescent and neon colored ocean floor. So that's what I was going for with this card. And using the black card to start, the bright colors of the Pixie powder really show up nicely. So I wanted to do some urchins on the bottom of the ocean in bright neon colors. So what I use is my Distress Oxides, and I masked the bottom of the stamp with a bit of post-it tape. That way the ink would only go on the top area. And the best way to make sure the ink goes where you want it is to slightly tilt the ink pad instead of laying it flat. Now I removed the mask before stamping it, and then I repeated the colors because I wanted it to be a bit brighter than it shows up when you stamp it once. Now, if your ink pads are newer than mine or you've just refreshed them, you probably won't need to double stamp. Now, once I'm happy with that, I'm going to remove the mask and double stamp. And then I'm going to use some vintage photo to selectively ink the bottom area of the stamp. Now, this is quite straight, so I didn't worry about masking the top here. And that I'm also going to double stamp. And then once I'm happy with the way this area looks, I'm going to move my stamp to the right hand side of my card and repeat this process. Now I'm ready to move on to the next part of my card. So for this part, I'm going to use the castle stamp. This stamp is the Far World Castle, and although it's only a small castle, you'll see that I used it to make a larger castle. So first I double stamped it with VersaFine Black Onyx ink, and black on black gives it a nice faraway look to the castle, so it's in the background. And then I moved the stamp over so it was slightly overlapping, and then re-stamped it. That way my castle is slightly bare. Of course, you don't need to use black for this, but like I said, I was going for the dark but bright theme. Now, once I'm happy with that, I'm going to add in my next stamp. And for this, I'm going to use the one called Marine Kelp. The first one I'm going to stamp at full size, and I'm just going to use a bit of post-it tape and mask the bottom urchin. It's actually the same tape as before. And using my picked raspberry, I will stamp that twice. As you can see, with just one stamping, it's not quite bright enough, so it really does need more than one stamping with the Distress Oxide. Then I'm going to move my post-it tape and move my stamp over and make this bit of Marine Kelp a little bit shorter than the last one. I'm also going to mask the bottom area here and use some Rusty Hinge Distress Oxide for this one. Now, for some reason, I had to stamp this one 3 times, but perhaps this ink pad has had a bit more love than the others. Now, I was a bit concerned that the ink might smudge, so after stamping this, I used my heat tool just to make sure that those 2 bits of kelp were nice and dry before moving on to my third piece. Now, for the third piece, which is also the shortest piece, I'm going to use the picked raspberry again, and I'm going to add a little bit more of that post-it tape just to make sure that I don't get any on the urchins. And as you can see, my underwater scene is starting to really come together. Now, once I'm happy with that, I'm going to move on to the sand at the bottom of the card. So for this, I used a bit of vintage photo and spread it on my craft desk and sprayed it with water. And then I painted it across the bottom. And just like before, when I used water on this card, I made sure to dry it every now and then so that the paper wouldn't get too weak and wouldn't tear. Now I had to add more than one layer to get the brown that I wanted at the bottom here. But it depends what look that you're going for, so you can keep adding layers until you're happy. Now my castle seems like it's floating there, so I wanted to have some sand under that as well. And when I first put the sand on the castle, I think I went a little bit too far to the left, as you'll see here. So I fixed this later on by just adding a bit of water and blotting it off. And that removed the harsh line on the left-hand side of the sand. If you haven't tried watercoloring with your distress inks or distress oxides, you're really missing out because they're quite versatile and you can use them to add color this way as well. If you find it difficult, you can always heat emboss your images first. But this sand was quite easy to paint. Now once I'm happy with that, I'm going to make sure that I use my heat tool again and make sure it's thoroughly dry before adding my next stamp. So for this I used the Mermaid Alana, and I wanted to use VersaFine Onyx Black because this ink stays wet a little bit longer than Memento or other inks. So what I did is I double stamped Alana just to make sure there was lots of ink on her. And then once it was finished, I used my clear embossing powder over top. Now it's important that your background is completely dry before doing this so that your embossing powder doesn't stick anywhere else. Now, once I've removed stray bits of embossing powder with my paintbrush, I can use my heat tool to melt that clear embossing powder. And as you can see, Alana now stands out on the black background and it looks so beautiful. Now I wanted to color in these sea urchins, but I couldn't use my regular alcohol ink or Copics to color it in because it would smudge the Distress Oxides. So I decided to try something new and use my pencil crayons or Polychromos to fill it in. It turns out they work really well on black paper as well. So just using colors that were approximately the same as the ink, I filled in the sea urchins on the bottom, and I was so happy with the result that I decided to do the same on the sea kelp. One of the great things that I love about card making is that you can experiment and try new things all the time. Now I also used a little bit of brown on the pebbles at the bottom here, and I used it to emphasize the sand. And then I did the same underneath the castle just to reinforce the idea that that was part of the ground and it wasn't a floating castle. Now I did speed up my coloring a little bit here, but as you can see, it doesn't really take that long to fill in these images, and it changes it completely and makes the card look so much more finished and so much more polished. So I was very happy with the results. And I think these pencil crayons really highlighted the brightness of the Distress Oxides and really gave it that neon look, so that this card is definitely bright but dark. I'd love to know how you've gotten on with using pencil crayons on your cards. Please leave me a comment below and let me know. Now once I'm happy with that, I'm going to move on to the next part of my card. So I felt like it needed a bit more brightness at the top, So I used some white unicorn pigment ink and my sponge dauber to apply this in sort of a triangular shape over the top third of the card. Kind of like the sunlight from above is hitting the water and reflecting down on the mermaid Atlanta. Now, because I've added heat embossing to the main image there, the pigment ink doesn't stick, but I did use my finger just to wipe it off to make sure that that image stayed nice and black and glossy. And I'm just going to add a tiny bit more of that pigment ink, and then I'll be happy with my background. And I can move on to the last step. So now I'm going to use some of the Lavinia Stamps glitter. This is actually called moon dust. And using my glue pen, I'm just going to draw a nice line at the bottom and then use some autumn dew moon dust. And once I'm happy with that, I'm going to do the last thing and add some glossy accents. This will look like bubbles all over the card and will be the perfect finishing embellishment. Now I'm going to leave my card to dry completely before I adhere it to my card base. So using some double-sided adhesive tape, I will adhere this to my card front, which is 5 by 7 inches, and then just trim off the top and side there where I've got extra paper showing. I hope this video has inspired you and you have enjoyed seeing my take on the Lavinia Stamps theme, Dark but Bright. Have a great day.